I want to talk to you guys today about science. 1 Peter 3:15 says, "But sanctify the Lord in your hearts and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear." This verse is a good reminder of our jobs as Christians to be ready to defend our faith when talking to those outside the faith. Hopefully, you're at the point where you believe Christianity with your whole heart, and if not, I pray that you are seeking unbiased answers to the questions that you still may have about the faith. One of our primary duties of spreading the gospel or the good news is to be able to give answers when we are questioned about our faith. If you're sharing the gospel to an atheist, they may have some valid questions that should be addressed in order to get them to see that there is a God and that this fact is obvious if you take a look at things, an honest look at things. I want to talk to you today about the questions that might come up in your witnessing that are science related. A lot of atheists are brainwashed into believing that science and the Bible conflict. They listen to a lot of like-minded opposition to religion, and they're convinced that science somehow disproves the Bible. I want to explore with you today a bunch of reasons why that is not the case. Psalm 19:1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of the Lord, and the firmament shows his handiwork." In other words, if you simply look to the heavens, the complexity and awesomeness of what you are witnessing is a testimony to the fact that there is a God. Something that amazing and highly complex is very unlikely to have happened by chance. And we're going to look at a few things today that bring this to light. Romans 1:18-23 says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things." So this verse is basically saying that if someone doesn't accept the truth, that's because they are suppressing it. In other words, the fact that there is a God is easy to see to those that don't see it, don't want to. And the Bible says that these people are without excuse. Professing to be wise, they became fools, it says. And we're going to look at a great number of examples of this in this video today. And I want to start off with a good example of a quote that came from a scientist. And he says, "Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institution of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but to the contrary, that we are forced by our priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." And this is a quote from Richard Lewontin, who is a professor and a geneticist. And I just hope that when you heard that, and maybe you need to pause that and reread it because he said a lot there, but I hope that that quote sent a chill down your spine. Somehow in school, we bought the concept that science is the understanding of how things work based on observation, experimentation, and study. But this quote is an open admission that it is quite the contrary. He openly admitted that he is ignoring the evidence that is pointing to the supernatural because he already has his mind made up that the material is the answer. In other words, even though the evidence points to something supernatural, He rejects evidence because he doesn't like what it suggests. What type of honest experimentation is that? What if I was a detective and I ignored evidence that pointed to a suspect just because that person is a friend or relative? Since I don't like the suggestion, what if I try other possible suspects and ignore all the clear signs that point to my friend or my family member? Do you see how dangerous and backwards thinking that is? You can't go around ignoring evidence just because you don't like where it leads. And furthermore, you definitely cannot pass that off as the truth. Dr. David Berlinski, who, by the way, is a non-religious secular scientist, said it best when he said, "A scientist eager to be proven wrong is a myth put out by the scientists, and that people will fudge the data when they can get away with it." And if you don't believe that, there is a good example. It's called Haeckel's false embryo drawings. Look that up when you get a chance. These drawings were supposed to prove evolution and were proven to be fraudulent, but can still be found in textbooks today. This is a good example of the fact that this idea of evolution is trying to be passed off as truth, and they're trying to make it seem like it's been proven when in reality it has not been. So what do the facts say? What is the truth? One of the biggest arguments for atheism is that the scientific data does not support the existence of God, therefore God must not exist, which couldn't be further from the truth, by the way. And what they fail to recognize when they say this is that by arguing the data does not support something is not proof. That proves nothing. I can't try to prove a point by saying I don't see evidence for it. That would be the equivalent of me saying that you must not have a job because every time I see you, you aren't at work. And I have never seen your timesheets or met your boss, so I conclude that you don't have a job. Do you see how ridiculous that is? Just because I haven't witnessed something does not prove or disprove anything. You are choosing a belief based on faith, not on evidence. So, did you know that atheism is a faith-based belief? It's very much so a faith-based belief. You can't prove something by lack of evidence, and lack of belief is no more than a guess. It's a guess that they believe is educated, but I actually beg to differ. Darwin's theory of evolution is one of the most cited references for atheists because they feel as though they can say that there is no need for God due to this. If all life is explained by one form going through natural selection and random variation to create every different species we see today, the atheist argues that this means all life is chance, and that is a proof that there is no God. Unfortunately, for the atheist, this can't be further from the truth. And to make matters worse, the entire argument for evolution is flimsy at best for several reasons. And I'm going to go through a couple of them with you. For one, even if evolution were true, which the evidence doesn't support, by the way, that still doesn't answer the question of where did the first organism come from and what directed the initial and subsequent changes. Two, it has never been observed that a living thing changes its fundamental nature. The best that has ever been observed is finch beaks, where the size of a bird beak changed based on environmental factors, but it was still a bird. A change in moth colors based on pollution was observed, but it was still a moth. Much more evidence is needed to draw the conclusion that the entire nature of a thing would change over time. Number three, and perhaps the biggest, is the fossil records. They do not support evolution, and in fact, they go completely against it. Levels of digging in the ground expose different layers that are categorized by periods. One of the earliest periods is known as the Cambrian period. And at this time, a Cambrian explosion took place where several different complex life forms appeared in that layer with no trace of an ancestor in the previous layer. This destroys the theory that millions of years created all of these different changes and that these changes were gradual. Number four, where are these alleged in-between forms today? In other words, if these changes take millions of years, shouldn't there always be some type of in-between form that we can witness? Shouldn't we be able to put the pieces together in the stages? One of the quote-unquote observations is that whales and cows came from the same line of mutations. If this were true, why have we never witnessed an animal in between these two? No matter how far back we go, whales stay whales and cows stay cows. And that brings me to number five. The mechanics of the change between the different creatures would certainly lead to death. Life underwater and on the ground is very different, so the whale cow has a serious problem. He needs a different type of skin to live underwater, different breathing mechanisms. He needs protected eyes and ears and nose underwater. On the ground, he eats differently, moves differently, which means all different internal systems. The in-between creature would be inadequate for life underwater or on ground. Dr. David Berlinski did the math on the amount of morphological changes that would be needed, and he stopped at around 50,000. If we honestly take a look at the function of the human body, evolution makes no sense at all. Our body has systems of organs like heart, lungs, blood, stomach, brain, etc. that need to be fully formed and operational at the same time in order to support life. Assuming our brains are fully functional now, the beginning stages of proposed evolution model would suggest a brain only capable of a vegetated state. How could this person survive? How could this person reproduce or even mate in a vegetative state? We see how daily any of these systems, such as the heart, brain, or anything not operating at fully optimal levels, are terminal to the host. The explanation that in the beginning these systems were fully functional is the only one that makes sense. It goes in line with the creation account we find in Genesis. In the beginning, man was created, fully formed, and not some work in progress. Dr. David Berlinski has a good quote, and he asks the question, how come we can't set up a computer program to see the unfolding of the evolutionary process in biology? The computer isn't going to generate anything realistic if it uses Darwinian mechanisms, and will generate something realistic only if it doesn't use Darwin mechanisms. This is an important point. Number 6, the claim is that mutation is the engine of evolution, yet all lab results we have makes this problematic. Minimal mutations such as hair color, etc. happen frequently, but only make minor changes in appearance, still same in nature. In other words, a cow is still a cow, a whale is still a whale. All major mutations have been observed to terminate the host. The best example of this is computer code. Major random code changes will quickly and definitely crash the system. The same principle applies to the human body. It is, after all, a series of codes that make up our DNA, which leads me to my next point. Number 7, the code of DNA is so complicated it is far from random. Dr. Anthony Flew was a British philosopher and leading atheist debater in his time. He argued that one should assume atheism until solid evidence of God exists. After careful study of the scientific discoveries of his time, he felt he had no choice but to recant his position and argue for the other side. One of the most noted reasons he listed were discoveries in complex DNA code. DNA is made up of 4 chemicals, A, T, G, and C. In every cell of the human body, this code is 3 billion letters long and is what instructs the actions of the cell. It has often been compared to binary code and the way a computer program is built. And the main thing we know about computer programming is this: it requires a programmer. The result you would have from this program is books worth of code that act as instruction for the book of life. The question is, can books write themselves? Nowhere do we observe a complex program that created itself. Berlinski joked that this is like implying the book Don Quixote turned into the book War and Peace by copying errors. His point was that copying errors in the process of evolution to produce man as we know today is equally as absurd as this example. It's hard not to see that this obvious level of intelligence had to come from an intelligent creator. DNA is like a computer program, but far more advanced than any software ever created, is what Bill Gates said. So why do you hear so little about scientists that oppose evolution in spite the obvious lack of evidence? Ask the editor of Dr. Stephen Meyer, who was basically blacklisted from the Smithsonian for publishing, not even authoring, mind you, just publishing an article by Meyer questioning the validity of evolution. If we're a free-thinking society, shouldn't all ideas be explored? To the scientists, however, it's hard to get research funding going against the grain when that is the accepted theory of the time. The unfortunate result of this is a society that can't think for themselves and rely on weak explanations rather than questioning the validity. The obvious question is how many deaths happened during the decades when it was believed that draining people of quote-unquote bad blood could heal their sicknesses. This used to be a standard practice. Doctors would put leeches on patients, or in other ways drain their blood from them when they were sick, because they believed that sickness was somehow caused from their blood going bad. Now, what we know today, we know that blood is necessary for healing, and I'm sure this caused many deaths. I wonder how many people died from these bad practices that were accepted at the time. And furthermore, I wonder how many patients turned down this quote-unquote procedure because they blindly just took someone's word for it without thinking for it themselves, just putting their trust in doctors who supposedly know their craft, but obviously were wrong for many, many years. How long was an earth-centered universe accepted as the standard? Science has a history of going through long periods of time accepting false beliefs. Why would we not explore all possibilities and take whatever road leads us to the truth, unless the truth is not what we're pursuing? And what about the Big Bang Theory, you might ask? The interesting fact is that the Big Bang Theory also does not disprove God, because it still doesn't answer the question, was there a Big Banger that initiated the Big Bang? All it does is acknowledge the fact that there was a bang. In fact, when the theory was first introduced, many rejected it because they felt it seemed to have implications of initiation by a higher power. Therefore, it was dismissed as too religious. It does have consistency with in the beginning God said, and all things went into motion. To explain this explosion without God makes no sense. It absolutely defies logic to say that an explosion happened at random, and out of it we see order that can be observed in our universe today. Never has a bomb or any other form of an explosion gone off that resulted in balance and order. And in fact, the opposite is true in nature that we can witness. If a bomb were to go off in a building today, we would see destruction and death. We would not see order and life. Why would we believe that a cosmic bang should be any different? Furthermore, the idea that nothing came in contact with nothing, and from that everything came into existence, is almost laughable. Yet this is the common accepted belief. Famous atheist Richard Dawkins swears by the fact that nothing created everything in this bang. How can nothing execute action? Where did nothing acquire the material needed to produce everything? When have we ever observed nothing create something, let alone something as complex as what we witness in the universe today? These explanations almost go out of their way to go against common sense, and yet somehow they're accepted. In the 19th and 20th century, it was believed that the universe was static or not expanding at all. This comforted those who didn't believe in God because it implies the universe was always in existence. But this theory got disproven with the invention of the Hubble telescope. This invention solidified the knowledge that the universe was in fact expanding. The fact that the universe is expanding implies that it's moving from a starting point. The fact that there's a starting point is consistent with God creating it at a point in time. Both of these views require faith, but is it easier to call nothing the creator rather than saying it was God? Remember, we aren't searching for ease, we're searching for truth here. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau says that the visible order of the universe proclaims a supreme intelligence, and I would have to agree with him there. I think that by the visible order of things that we are witnessing, we can see that there has to be some type of all-powerful, very, very highly intelligent force behind it. And now that we've moved into space, all the evidence that we've uncovered in space, in addition to that previously mentioned, also suggests that there's a God. A very important aspect of science is numbers and probabilities. Astrobiologist Guillermo Gonzalez was on a NASA research team that sought out to answer an important question. Actually, Guillermo openly admitted his interest in space was a product of the era of space movies that he grew up in as a kid. He was fascinated to know if something else was out there, and what he found was in fact more substantial. He and several other scientists noted that all living things have the same requirements that need to be met in order to sustain life. All of these factors would each be mandatory for a planet in order to sustain life. Examples of the type of factors a planet would need in order to sustain life are liquid water, which means the planet can't be so hot where water evaporates or so cold where it freezes. It has to be a terrestrial planet, meaning it has to be made of silicones and rocks and metals. It must be within a specific range from the sun, which plays a role in heating and cooling and water temperatures. So if the Earth was 5% closer to the sun than we are now, we'd see 900-degree temperatures, which can't sustain life. If the Earth was 20% further, that would result in sterilization by freezing. Do you see how our location is extremely crucial to being order to sustain life? It must be protected by giant gas planets that could absorb comet impact. It must have a nearly circular orbit. It must be the correct mass. It has to have a large moon. The moon around Earth is a quarter of its size, and it stabilizes its axis at the 23.5 degrees and is needed for seasonal change and the pull it has on water. It has to have sufficient magnetic field. Too small and solar winds strip away the atmosphere. It has to have tectonic plates. It must be a good ratio of liquid water and continents. It must have a moderate rate of rotation. The size of the sun has to be within a range. Too large and it would pull it off of its rotation. And only one side of the planet would face the sun and one side would be constantly turned away, which would mean that side would not be able to support life. It must be the correct location in the galaxy. It must have proper oxygen, nitrogen, carbon ratio in the atmosphere. So his calculations that he came up with were that of the 20 factors that were needed to be absolutely necessary for life, I want you to see this number that he came up with. This is the number that he came up with of the chances of a planet that is able to sustain life. Now, I don't know about you, but although this number is technically not impossible, it's highly improbable. This is why he wrote a book and did a documentary of his findings, and he called it A Privileged Planet, because it appears that our planet has beat a lot of odds just to host life. Is this a miracle? When you think of it, the more you learn, the less accidental it all seems. And I think when God created the earth, he went out of his way because he knew that man would increase in knowledge. Man would come up on these factors and be able to look at these things. And eventually we would know that there's no way that this is an accident. This has to be something that's planned. It's too complex. There's too many things going against us. This is something that was not an accident. It was planned. The almost comical part is that in spite of these odds, you have so-called brilliant minds like Stephen Hawking that dismiss the idea that there's a God and would rather believe that there's aliens, which the funny thing about that still does not answer the question, where did the aliens come from? And I've also heard people say that aliens planted life on Earth. Okay, well then that just takes us back one more step. Where did the aliens come from? Even though it's absurd and nonsense to believe that, because we have absolutely no proof of aliens, where did the aliens come from is still the question that the person making this argument would still have to answer. You still aren't answering the question where life came from. You're just taking it back a step. Both ideas require faith, and while there's no evidence for any other life forms that have been witnessed, the evidence still seems to be stacking in favor of there being a God. Abraham Lincoln says, "I can see how it is impossible for a man to look down on the earth and be an atheist, but I cannot conceive how he can look up to the heavens and say there is no God." Just the odds that you are here alone are staggering. We've already talked about the odds with a planet surviving life in this harsh solar system, where everywhere else you go outside of our planet, life is not sustainable. We have to go through all of these suits and mechanisms to try to keep a person alive outside of this planet. On this planet, life is easily sustainable. So the fact that you're here is already beating staggering odds. And then let's take the fact of life into consideration. The average male, we're gonna get a little intimate here. The average male is said to ejaculate between 250 and 600 million sperm at a time. Of those, only about 200 actually make it to the egg. To be the one that made it, you beat some pretty big odds, and yet here you are. Is this chance? that you're individually here beating some serious odds to achieve a purpose, what makes more sense? My prayer for you is not only that you find your purpose, but also that you acknowledge the fact that there is one that has given your life a purpose before the foundation of the earth. You are not an accident. Do not let anybody tell you that. You are here for a reason and with a purpose that only you and your life can fulfill. Seek God and find your purpose so that at the end you can receive your heavenly reward for a life well lived. I hope you guys take the time to study science with an unbiased perspective, and I promise that you'll be hard pressed to make the case for there not being a God when you do. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.